Hi, Professor Zavala. Thanks for joining us today.
It's good to see you, Corey. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited that you've chosen some works for us that incorporate animals and have to do with our symposium theme. So I'll let you take it away, and I'm excited to learn more.
Great. Well, I'm very excited for the symposium. I think it's a really original topic, and I think the idea to have conversations with faculty about works that feature animals is really brilliant. So I'm very pleased to be included. So I've chosen for my artist and my work of art, the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. Um, and I have had the pleasure of studying and writing and curating Frida Kahlo works for the last number of years. And so my interest in Frida Kahlo's creative relationship to flora and fauna, to plants and animals, really began around 2013-14 when I was invited to curate an exhibition for the New York Botanical Garden that focused specifically on that theme. And it was not something I'd really given much thought to before. There's a wonderful scholar named Nancy Deffenbach who has thought quite a bit about Kahlo's relationship to the natural world, but it wasn't something that I was particularly focused on until I was invited to curate this exhibition. And it was a real opportunity for me to start to think in a new way about Frida Kahlo. So to start off, I've arranged here a slide with 9 self-portraits by Frida Kahlo. These date from what we might think about as her kind of mid-career period. And in this period, she was spending quite a bit of time creating these 3/4 format self-portraits, which of course, this format has a very long history in the history of art. And Kahlo would have been keenly aware of this tradition of portraiture, this particular compositional format of portraiture. She was an admirer, for example, of the works of Albrecht Dürer, and there are some really beautiful portraits by Dürer in this sort of frontal or 3/4 view. So the 9 that I've chosen really span this period in her mid-career from 1937, which is the very first portrait in my slide, to 1945. And there are more self-portraits from this period, but I've just chosen these 9 because they feature this unified format. And of course, we see that here she includes animals from her own menagerie of pets. So the first self-portrait is the 1937 self-portrait that is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And it's called Fu Lang Chang and Me. And Kahlo ultimately gave this self-portrait to an American friend named Mary Sklar. And if the viewers go to the Museum of Modern Art's website, they can see that there's another object that goes with this, which is a mirror that has the exact same kind of frame as the self-portrait does. And the idea was that Mary Sklar could look at Kahlo's self-portrait and then look at herself in the mirror, and they would be reunited as friends. And I think that's a really beautiful gesture. But in this 1937 rendition, we see Kahlo with one of her spider monkeys. So over the course of her life, she had at least 2 spider monkeys. And these were pets that she shared with her husband, Diego Rivera. And the 2 spider monkeys were named Fu Lang Chang and Caimito del Guayabal. And the name Fu Lang Chang seems to come from Frida Kahlo's admiration for Asian culture. They lived for a period in San Francisco, and in letters to her mother, she describes her fascination with Chinatown in San Francisco. And also she describes her feeling that the little children that she saw in Chinatown were very beautiful. So it's possible that for that reason, she named this first spider monkey Fu Lang Chang. And it is a little bit of a stereotypical name, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, from the 21st century perspective, to name a spider monkey with an Asian sounding name is problematic. But of course, in the mid 20th century, intellectuals were doing this kind of thing. So the first little monkey is Fu Lang Chang, and then it appears that within a few years, they had a second spider monkey that may have actually been a female monkey that they named Caimito del Guayabal, and that's a municipality in Cuba. And a caimito is also a kind of sort of a fruit that's related to apples. And so perhaps they thought the little spider monkey looked like one of these sour apples. But at any rate, if we look at the 1945 portrait, which is the last one in the series, we see the little spider monkey there as well. And we also see one of Kahlo's hairless dogs. These are dogs that have a very long history in Mesoamerican culture. They predate the arrival of the Europeans. And Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera had several of these dogs. And these dogs are very important in Mesoamerican belief systems because there is evidence that such dogs were buried when their owners died, and the dogs were believed to shepherd the souls of their owners to the underworld. And then in several of the examples in the bottom row, you also see parrots, tropical parrots, and Kahlo and Rivera kept parrots as well. And in some letters to the American artist, Emmylou Packard, who was an assistant to Diego Rivera on one of the murals he painted in San Francisco in 1939-40. And then Emmylou Packard lived for a period at Kahlo's home with her in 1941. And evidently, Frida Kahlo and Emmylou Packard were very good friends. And in letters between the two, Kahlo calls them parrots, pericas, which is sort of a Spanish word connoting a sort of chatty parrot. And so they seem to have a very close affectionate bond. And they also had sort of twinned pet parrots. And Kahlo writes to tell Emmylou Packard that one of the little parrots died. And Emmylou Packard, in turn, in some of her writings, describes the fact that one of the parrots, whose name was evidently Bonito, which means pretty, was allowed to roam the dining room table to eat the pats of butter that were set out with the place settings. And so Kahlo and Rivera both had great affection for this menagerie of pets. So if you go to the next slide. Thank you. So the particular self-portrait that I'm going to focus on is this one, which has become perhaps one of the best known of Frida Kahlo's self-portraits from this period. And this is a portrait known as Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird. It dates to 1940. It's in this format that I've just discussed, and it's in the collection of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's part of the Nicholas Marai collection of Mexican art. And Nicholas Marai was a friend of Frida Kahlo's. They met in the early 1930s, and eventually they developed a relationship, an emotional relationship. And he owned two Frida Kahlo paintings, this one and a still life with Parrot. And they're both in the collection of the Harry Ransom Center. And this self-portrait evidently was painted by Frida Kahlo as she was making the decision to end her amorous relationship with Nicholas Marai that had gone on, sort of been on and off relationship for a number of years. In 1939, she and Diego Rivera divorced. They were divorced for about a year. And then at the end of 1940, she made the decision to reconcile with Rivera, and they were remarried in San Francisco in December of that year. And so it's in that period of 1939-40 that Kahlo paints this self-portrait as a gift for Nicholas Marai. And conventional interpretations of this painting have explored the iconography, and particularly the iconography of the hummingbird. And a hummingbird is a kind of talisman of love in traditional Mexican belief. And so the conventional interpretation is that Frida Kahlo appears here in this frontal format with a little spider monkey over one shoulder and a black cat over another shoulder, and that the sort of dead hummingbird that's hanging from this thorn necklace around her neck is a way of her gesturing to Nicholas Marai that their love is lost, that she is terminating their relationship to reconcile with Diego Rivera. And there's by now a sort of interpretive tradition of looking at Frida Kahlo paintings and interpreting them very biographically. And that's not to say that that's wholly incorrect, but I think it actually diminishes some of our understanding of Kahlo's creativity and our understanding of her intellect and of her process. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. So as we look at this self-portrait, it is an extraordinary self-portrait. It's one of the iconic works that we associate with Frida Kahlo. When I curated the exhibition for the New York Botanical Garden, I was really fortunate to be given permission to borrow this painting, and it appeared on the cover of the exhibition catalog for our show. And so here we see a compositional format with the animals, and also notice that Kahlo has compressed her figure all the way to the foreground of the compositional space, which is very shallow. And the background is comprised of these luscious leaves of aroid plants that really push the figure all the way to the foreground. And so we saw that in the 9 self-portraits that I arranged in the first slide. But this is actually a portrait compositional structure that Kahlo began experimenting with much earlier, In the first painting that she ever sold, which is now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, we see the same compositional structure. And that painting is called Two Women, Salvadora and Herminia, who were two of the domestic servants in the Kahlo household. And so in that portrait of two women, we see the women again compressed all the way to the foreground, and then this beautiful screen, in that case, of a citrus tree that sort of serve as the backdrop. And it really creates this sense of figures enclosed by nature. And so again, I think it's a way that Frida Kahlo is gesturing towards her appreciation of the natural world of both plants and animals. So I want to talk a little bit more about the animals in the painting, and I'll talk a bit more about the plant imagery as well. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So part of what interests me is thinking about the way that Kahlo conceptualized of her paintings and the approach that she took to executing them. So part of the sort of mystique of Frida Kahlo is that she was a very emotional person, that she had a very sort of difficult life. And those things may be true, but I also think that Kahlo absolutely loved the natural world, and also was a very vibrant personality, a very intelligent woman. And so I think it's important to look at her paintings and to try to prioritize an interpretation that foregrounds her creative capabilities and her intellect and her process, as I said. So one of the interesting things is that in recent years, there was an archive of Frida Kahlo's personal belongings that since her death had been hidden away at her family home. So today, the Frida Kahlo Museum is in the house that was her childhood home where she grew up. And it's the home that she and Diego Rivera really took as their residence after 1939 when they reconciled, and after a period of travel in the United States and for Kahlo in Paris. And so in 1954, when Frida Kahlo died, Diego Rivera evidently took quite a number of her possessions and sealed them up in what had been a bathroom in the house. And he stipulated that those material belongings should not be revealed or taken out until after his own death. But a longer period went by, and it was in the early 2000s that the director of the Frida Kahlo Museum and the Dolores Olmedo Museum, a man named Carlos Phillips Olmedo, who is the director of the Kahlo and Rivera estate, made the decision to finally unwall this sort of hidden archive. And in that cache of materials were several thousand photographs. And so the photograph that I'm showing here of the cat is one of the photographs that was found in this collection of photographs. And what it reveals to us is that Frida Kahlo wasn't necessarily painting in an immediate and direct way from life, that she might have actually been conceiving of her sort of iconographic arrangement of objects through the use of photographs. So the cat photograph here is obviously shows that the cat in the painting is positioned in exactly the same way, with its back arched and its pale green eyes that you get a sense of in the photograph. And I think that that's very interesting for thinking about a sort of artistic awareness and a prioritizing of wanting to conjure certain compositional structures that might convey certain symbolic meanings. And so here we see Kahlo with the cat, and then the little monkey. And so I've just chosen one of numerous photographs of Frida Kahlo with one of her monkeys. There isn't an exact photograph that correlates to the position in which she has set the little monkey in the self-portrait. But the little monkey is either Fulan Chang or Caimito del Guayabal. He has a kind of quiet expression. He's looking down at something that he's holding in his hands, or his or her hands. It could be a female monkey. And if one looks closely at the painting, one sees that what the monkey is holding is actually one of the little pieces of the thorn necklace that Kahlo has represented is wound around her neck. And of course, this thorn necklace also brings to mind Christian iconography and imagery of Jesus Christ with the crown of thorns. So this is certainly an image perhaps of martyrdom, of sort of physical pain, perhaps emotional pain, and those things might relate to the issues around her relationship, both with Nicolas Marais and with Diego Rivera. But it's a very complex compositional structure. So she has depicted herself with this thorn necklace twined around her neck. If one looks closely, one sees that the thorns of the necklace are actually piercing the skin on her neck, and little drops of blood appear there. And then, of course, the hummingbird is hanging from a little wire or a little string that is tied to the thorn necklace. And then if we look a little bit higher in the composition, we see that, Kahlo appears as her characteristic self with her thick, dark brown hair wound around her head in braids and this beautiful purple ribbon sort of fastening the hair. And in the purple ribbon, she has positioned two silver filigree brooches that represent butterflies. And these brooches have actually been found in among the items in Frida Kahlo's wardrobe. And so the butterflies, of course, hearken to the sort of realm of insects as well. Very beautiful, delicate objects. And then if you look above that, you see that there are two sort of insect flower hybrids. And this is something that Frida Kahlo did from very early in her creative career. She would create these sort of dualistic images, very often of plant and animal or plant and human hybrids. And so they are flowers. The one on the left-hand side looks a bit like a zinnia, and the one on the right looks a bit like a fuchsia. Actually, if you go to the next slide, please. So here I've illustrated a zinnia and a fuchsia, and we can see that she's working from her understanding of these types of flowers, but she has transformed them into what look like butterflies or perhaps dragonflies. And this sense of hybridity and dualism and of course, is very fundamental both to Mexican identity. Mexico is conceived of as a country that is an amalgamation of two principal identities, the Spanish European and the Native American or indigenous. And so Kahlo, like many intellectuals of her period, of her generation, was very interested in this notion of hybridity. But the principle of dualism is also evoked by these hybrid creatures. And dualism as a way of thinking was very important, very fundamental to the Mesoamerican world. There are deities that are both male and female, that are terrifying and yet also sublime, that represent both life and death. And so this principle of dualism, I think, is something that Frida Kahlo was expressing. So if you could go back one slide just a moment for me, I want to say one more thing about her use of photography. So the other photograph that I've illustrated here is one of the many portraits that Nicholas Marais took of Frida Kahlo. And Nicholas Marais was a photographer who made a very successful career in commercial photography. And he pioneered a technique of color photography for advertising. And so there's a whole series of really extraordinary colorized portraits of Frida Kahlo that have become very, very popular. And there are exhibitions of these photographs by Nicholas Marais that travel just because people love to look at Frida Kahlo. But when Frida Kahlo received a copy of this particular portrait from Nicholas Marais in the mail, she wrote him a letter thanking him for sending the photograph. And she mentioned that Diego Rivera was particularly taken with this photograph, and he likened it to a portrait by Piero della Francesca. And so here we get a sense of the aesthetic appreciation that Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera had for Nicholas Marais' sort of talent as a portraitist. And so what I want to suggest as well, if we look at the portrait by Nicholas Marais, we see that in that color photograph, Kahlo is wearing a white blouse. She has a white shawl, a rebozo, wrapped around her shoulders. But if you look closely, you see that she's wearing a necklace made out of shells. And so what I'm suggesting, and then of course she has the purple ribbons in her hair. And so what I'm suggesting is that rather than painting her self-portrait from a mirror, which is sort of part of the mythology of Frida Kahlo, that there's a direct relationship between her self-portraits and herself and her emotional state, I actually suspect that she was creating these self-portraits working from photographs, and perhaps very often these color photographs by Nicholas Marais. So there's quite a similarity in terms of what Kahlo is wearing, and a relationship, I think, between that shell necklace and the idea of putting a thorn necklace around her throat in the painted portrait, and the sort of piercing of the delicate skin of the neck with the thorns from the vine. Okay, so you can go back to the next slide. So giving a little bit more attention to the theme of animals, I want to talk for a few minutes about the hummingbird. So as I said, conventional interpretations of this self-portrait um, describe the fact that the hummingbird is a known talisman to love in the Mexican sort of folk cultural context. And so here I'm showing you a photograph of an object that is actually in the collection of the British Museum that is one of these hummingbird talismans. And this one was collected by an anthropologist in Veracruz State, Mexico, in the town of Papantla. And this, apparently, this particular object housed in the British Museum is inscribed on the back, "Prayer to the Miraculous Hummingbird." And so within Mexican folk belief, hummingbirds are considered to be talismans of love. And evidently, some people believe that if you're trying to recapture a lost love, you need to have a hummingbird talisman. And so even still today in folk markets in Mexico and medicinal markets, and even on the internet, you can buy different objects, candles, necklaces, little sort of what seem to be prayer cards that have an invocation to hummingbirds so that one can be lucky in love. And so it's very possible that that's part of the iconographic meaning of the hummingbird in Kahlo's self-portrait. But I think it's important to observe that these little dried or desiccated hummingbird talismans really don't look very much like the hummingbird that Kahlo painted in this self-portrait. The hummingbird that is hanging from her necklace, while it might be dead, has the wings sort of beautifully spread out. And so what is being evoked there is the energy and the nervous flight of the hummingbird. So I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about that. If you can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that interests me about this particular self-portrait, and this is something that other scholars have observed, is that the frontality of this particular self-portrait and the relationship of the monkey and the cat looking somewhat ominous, the very sort of impassive expression on Frida Kahlo's face, very much seems to relate to painted icons. And Kahlo had a very sophisticated knowledge of art history, and I have no doubt that she was familiar with the sort of wide range of iconic paintings of otherworldly beings. And she would have also been very familiar with the representation of otherworldly beings in her own cultural context. And so scholars have noted that the relationship of the sort of frontality of Kahlo's self-presentation, the thorn necklace, calls to mind the Aztec female deity of Coatlicue. And so I'm illustrating here on the far right-hand side of the slide, the monolith of Coatlicue, which dates from around 1500 of the Common Era. And this monolith represents the principal female deity of the Aztec people. And this object is 8 feet tall, it's carved from stone, and it's in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And this object was unearthed in the very central part of Mexico City. And it probably sat on the platform of one of the numerous pyramids in the Aztec ceremonial precinct before that precinct was destroyed in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest. So Coatlicue is the principal female deity of the Aztec people, of the Aztec civilization, and she is the mother of their patron deity, the god of war, who is also the embodiment of the sun, and his name is Huitzilopochtli. And the word Huitzilopochtli is the word in the Aztec language of Nahua for this patron deity, but the name also means hummingbird from the left or hummingbird from the south. And Kahlo would have been very familiar with that sort of belief system. This is something that she and Diego Rivera and their intellectual contemporaries were very interested in studying and recovering an understanding of Aztec cosmography in order to sort of ground their creative identity and their nationalistic identity, not just in Mexico's European heritage from the post-conquest period, but also in Mexico's pre-Columbian heritage. And so I do believe that Kahlo may be likening herself to an otherworldly being in the self-portrait, and the hummingbird might connote that as well. The other thing that I want to point out is that in the monolith to Coatlicue, what we're looking at is a decapitated figure, because according to one of the narratives around Coatlicue, when she became impregnated with Huitzilopochtli, Her other children, including the goddess of the moon, were enraged. And so they decapitated their mother as a form of punishment. But what happened is that Huitzilopochtli sprang fully formed from his mother's body. And he punished his brothers and sisters by dismembering their bodies. And he threw his sister, the goddess of the moon, down the stairs of the pyramid or of the house. And so in the monolith of Coatlicue, what we see is a decapitated figure. And what emerges from the head are two writhing serpents. So here again, we have an invocation of the natural world, because snakes or serpents molt their skin. And for Mesoamerican people, this was taken as a sign of healing and as a sign of rebirth and regeneration. And so there's a lot of snake and serpent imagery in Mesoamerican visual culture. But the other thing that I want to point out, and Kahlo may have well understood this, is if you look below the fangs of the two prone serpent heads at the top of the monolith, there are a series of carved circular discs. And those carved circular discs actually represent precious fluid. So in this case, blood. So it's possible that in pricking her own skin representationally with the thorns on the vine, that Kahlo is also invoking this Mesoamerican belief in human blood as a precious fluid. And Mesoamerican people believed that in order to perpetuate the cosmological cycle, in order to perpetuate the movement of the sun through the sky, the rising and setting of the sun, that human sacrifice was necessary, the shedding of human blood. So the last thing I want to share is something that I've become very interested recently, which is the degree to which Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo both, as well as their intellectual peers, were studying conquest era manuscripts. And I've recently been working on a book with a colleague named Delia Cosentino, who is a professor at DePaul University. And part of that book looks at the way that Mexican intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century were looking both to archaeology, to monoliths like Coatlicue, and trying to understand the form, the urbanistic form of the Aztec city before the conquest. And they were undertaking a sort of creative resurrection of the Aztec city in order to imagine or reimagine the connections between modern Mexico City and the Aztec city. So as part of that research process, I've been thinking very much about a mural by Diego Rivera, which is in the National Palace in Mexico City. And it depicts the Aztec city on the eve of the Spanish conquest. And in the foreground of that mural is an extraordinary market scene. And Aztec Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, which was the name of the city during Aztec times, had a sister city called Tlatelolco. And after conquering Tlatelolco, the principal market for these twin cities was in Tlatelolco. Spanish conquerors describe this. And another source that describes the extraordinary market at Tlatelolco is an ethnographic source, a manuscript in 12 books called the Florentine Codex. Now, the actual title of this manuscript is The General History of the Things of New Spain. And this was an ethnographic encyclopedia that was written both in the Aztec language of Nahuatl and in Spanish between the 1560s and the 1580s at a college in Tlatelolco. And this college was overseen by Franciscan friars, but they were working in collaboration with authors and artists who were indigenous. And so the Florentine Codex is an extraordinary ethnographic encyclopedia of the Aztec world in the pre and post-conquest period. It's over 2,000 pages long. It has over 2,000 images. And much of the information came to the Franciscan friars, particularly one friar named Bernardino de Sahagún, through his collaboration with indigenous authors and artists who actually wrote out the Nahuatl text and painted the pictures. So one of the books, which is book 11, is captioned Earthly Things, and it's an extraordinary description of the flora and fauna and of the mineral wealth of central Mexico. And there's a section of book 11 that describes all of the beautiful birds of Mesoamerica, because indigenous people valued birds very highly. Birds represented sort of different principles, but they also valued bird feathers because they had a tradition of making visual images, objects out of bird feathers. And among the most prized were the feathers of the quetzal bird and of the hummingbird, because they have these beautiful iridescent feathers. So there's one particular passage in this book 11 of the Florentine Codex that describes the attributes of the hummingbird. And it describes the fact that hummingbirds are very, very lively figures, very energetic, intense figures. And one of the things that is described in the text is the sort of annual cycle of the hummingbird. So if we look at the illustration, we see that there are a number of hummingbirds depicted sort of mid-flight. And the artists that painted this image have taken great care in showing us the different colors of hummingbird feathers. You see beautiful yellow and green and also gray. But if you look at the little tree that's in the center of the image, and if you can point to that, you'll see that there's a little hummingbird that appears to be hanging from the tree. And what the text describes is that during the dry season, and central Mexico is characterized less by winter and summer than by dry season and rainy season. And the dry season is during what we think of as the winter months. So the text actually describes that during the winter months, some hummingbirds go into a state of torpor, or sort of hibernation. And the text describes that they pierce their little beaks into the branches of a tree and they rest there. And then when the thunder returns or the rainy season returns, the hummingbirds are sort of reanimated and they take off again in their nervous flight. And so I know for a fact that Diego Rivera was studying the Florentine Codex in order to create this encyclopedic image of his own of this market scene. And of course, this is the period when he and Frida Kahlo have reunited. And today in the Frida Kahlo archive at the Frida Kahlo Museum, there are copies of pages of the Florentine Codex that evidently Diego Rivera hand colored or commissioned another artist to hand color in order to capture the beautiful color of these conquest era and pre-Columbian era manuscripts. And so while I don't deny that the whole narrative about Nicholas Murai is certainly relevant to this painting, and he was the owner of the painting. And it's very possible that the painting was a sort of, a parting gift, Kahlo's way of breaking up with Nicholas Murai. I think it's really important to try to recover some of the sort of intellectual dynamism, not just the emotional sort of turmoil that went into making Frida Kahlo's art, but the intellectual dynamism that she possessed, and to think about the various sources that she might have used to create this extraordinary self-portrait that shows the monkey, the cat, and of course the hummingbird. So that's what I have to share.
I think I'm on mute, so maybe you can hear me now. Am I good? Thank you so much. It's so interesting to, especially learning about those rich connections with the Florentine Codex, but also to hear about some of the works that you're working on now. So thank you so much for contributing to this ongoing conversation about animals and the arts.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I look forward to watching the other videos and to listening at the symposium. So good luck.
Great, thanks.